My name is Glenn Doman, and I am the chairman of the board of directors of the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential in Philadelphia. With me today are two other members of the board of directors of the Institutes in Philadelphia. Chatham Roberto Wheat is the senior board member, and he has been serving the children without any charge to the Institutes for 31 years. I believe he's hiding somewhere in the back row. Rob, are you there? The other member of the board of directors is your own Dr. Somoto. Dr. Somoto has served for many, many years the children of the world. He has spent great amounts of money from his own pocket to travel around the world to be helpful to the children, to give generously, super generously of his time to the children of the world. And we are very grateful to have him, and I am very proud that he is my friend. We are all deeply honored that so many of you have come to listen to what we have to tell you. During the last 40 years, I have carried on a love affair with several million mothers. Most of them I have never seen. Those mothers are the ones to whom I have written love letters in the form of my books, which are written to mothers and for mothers. With 100,000 of them, this love affair has been in the form of letters that have been written to me by them. And my proudest physical possession is those 100,000 letters that I have received from mothers during these years. With more than 20,000 of them, this love affair has been in the form of very personal level. During the last 40 years, I have had the privilege of living nose to nose with more than 20,000 mothers, more than 20,000 fathers, and more than 20,000 children. These children have ranged from children who were so profoundly brain injured as to be in a coma so complete as to render the children indistinguishable from death, and so that it has required machinery to be positive that this child is dead or alive. These children have ranged from such a child as that to, at the other end of the spectrum, children so superbly competent, intellectually, physically, and socially, as to be Renaissance children, to be almost unbelievably competent. What connection could there be between children so hurt as to be blind, paralyzed, speechless, and who are believed to be without intelligence on one hand, and children who are so superb that we might regard them as Renaissance children on the other hand? The profoundly brain-injured child is believed almost universally to be hopeless, and to speak of the possibility of making such a child completely well is considered to be not merely foolish talk, but strangely, somehow, immoral talk. It is untrue that such children are hopeless, as we have been demonstrating for many, many years. I must make clear at the very outset that we do not always succeed in making such children well, but every year we come closer to that dreamed of objective. In a world which actually believes that no single brain-injured child could possibly be made well, it is hardly surprising that we sometimes fail. What is surprising is that we often succeed. And what of the other child? The one I have referred to as the Renaissance child. Is it possible to give an ordinary baby the possibility of growing up to be first a Renaissance child, and then later a Renaissance human being, a Renaissance adult. Yet we have watched it happen over and over again. After a lifetime spent in living with and studying children from the moment of birth until they are mature, with children who ranged from children in the most primitive jungles on the face of the earth to the most primitive deserts and to the Arctic wastes, from there to children in the most civilized capitals of the world, in Tokyo and in Washington and in Paris, in Rio de Janeiro. We, the entire staff of the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential, are absolutely persuaded that every child born has, at the moment of birth, a greater potential than Leonardo da Vinci ever used. I would like to say once again that the entire staff of the institutes, all of the physicians, all of the educators, all of the therapists, all of the doctors, all of the everybody are convinced that every child born has, at the instant of birth, a greater potential intelligence than Leonardo da Vinci ever used. If that sounds like a pretty wild statement, I think that it's a very conservative statement. You must be very careful to hear what I said. I did not say that every child born has, at the instant of birth, a greater intelligence than Leonardo da Vinci. I said that every child born has, at the instant of birth, a greater potential intelligence than Leonardo da Vinci ever used. What is the connection between a child so like death that I need a machine to tell me if he's alive or not at one end of the spectrum, and a child so superb that he's almost unbelievable? Certainly in the beginning, more than half a century ago, when we first began to be concerned about brain-injured children, we had no idea that our inquiry would ever lead us to the belief that well children could be far better than they are. I think that the easiest way to help you to understand that is to have you briefly live our lives with us from the beginning, by me telling you historically how we came to these conclusions. In the beginning, more than 50 years ago, there was a brilliant brain surgeon named Temple Fay, and he was concerned at what was not happening with brain-injured children. Temple Fay was the professor, occupied the chair of neurosurgery and the chair of neurology at Temple University Medical School in Philadelphia. There are hundreds of thousands of people alive today who would be dead if it had not been for Temple Fay. In 1938, Dr. Fay did the first work, pioneered, invented the idea of hypothermia, of human refrigeration. And that caused great controversy. Today, there is not a hospital in the world that would dare call itself modern that doesn't use hypothermia in 1, 2, or 5 departments. All organ transplants are based on the ability to refrigerate. Post-traumatic cases, we have seen thousands of children whose lives would have been lost following automobile accidents if it were not for the ability to refrigerate those children. Between the years 1923 and 1941, Dr. Fay found himself alone in his desire to do something workable about brain-injured children. In 1941, a very, very, very young physical therapist was appointed to the staff at Temple University Medical School, who was the most junior member of the staff. And I was that young man. It was unbelievable to me that the senior member of the staff should have paid the slightest attention to the most junior member of the staff. And I will never understand it completely, but Dr. Fay kindly took me under his wing. Dr. Fay took me with him into the operating room and gave me the opportunity to see day after day after day the live, coral-colored, beautiful human brain. He was a great genius, and we had a very clear relationship. It was a master-slave relationship. He was the master, and I was the slave, which was very appropriate because he knew everything I wanted to know, and I knew nothing at all. He talked to me endlessly about the brain-injured children, who in those days were almost unknown. You could almost say that in those days there were no brain-injured children. Such children in those days so long ago were kept in bed, and they died rather quickly of hypostatic pneumonia or urinary tract infections from lying in bed. The few that existed were hidden away in the back of nursing homes and in attics. I would drive every day 14 miles for the privilege of driving Dr. Fay to the hospitals where he operated so I might ask him questions on the way to the hospital and then drive him back so I might ask him questions on the way back. A few years later, the team began to grow. My own wife, Katie, was a nurse, and so she joined the team. My younger brother had graduated from medical school, and he was a physiatrist, so he joined the team. And slowly the team began to grow. Young doctors, young nurses, young therapists, young educators, young psychologists. We were driven together by our common failures. And so we formed what is today called a rehabilitation team. In those days, so long ago, neither of those words was fashionable, and we thought of ourselves more clearly as what we really were. We were really a group of people, each of us failing in our individual responsibilities, and so we got together to form a sort of convoy to protect each other from our mutual failures. Today, that's called a rehabilitation team. In those days, we spent our morning in the operating room looking at live, throbbing human brains. Dr. Fay loved the human brain, and he quickly taught the rest of us to love the brain too. Dr. Fay was scornful of people who considered themselves experts on the brain and who had never seen a live human brain. People who had seen only dead brains in jars, or photographs of dead brains in jars, or line drawings of photographs of dead brains in jars. He said that if we human beings got our idea of what human beings were like by looking at corpses in coffins, we'd have a very strange idea of human beings. The human brain is not a dead gray and white thing in a jar. It is a live, throbbing, coral-colored thing. It is an unbelievable thing. During the almost half-century which has followed, and a half-century of studying the human brain, I have not found that familiarity breeds contempt. I have found myself to be in greater and greater awe of the human brain. To the exact degree that I am successful in getting you to join me in my awe of the human brain, will I succeed in making you understand today, or will I fail in making you understand?
I wish I had 3.5 years. Failing that, I'd like to have 3.5 months. What we've got is 3.5 hours divided in half by translation times because of my incompetence in Japanese. How I wish I were a child again. We have got many children, many little girls with red hair and green eyes, or blonde hair and blue eyes who understand and speak Japanese. Compared to them being a grown-up, I am sort of mentally retarded. Anyway, we decided that we had never seen or heard of a single brain-injured child who had ever gotten well, and we had never made one well. We decided we were going to find out what the matter was if it took the rest of our lives. And it has taken the rest of our lives. And many great, great physicians, Dr. Fay himself, Dr. Evan Thomas, my brother, Dr. Edward Lewin, and others have given their whole lives and did not live to see the end of the research. As I said, we spent our lives in the mornings each day looking at the live throbbing human brain in the operating room. We spent our afternoons seeing each other's patients in the varying hospitals where we were on the staff. And most importantly of all, we spent every evening beginning with dinner around someone's table in sessions that went on until either it got daylight or until we ran out of cigarettes, even with menthol, and talking in the most excited way. The question was, why? Why had no brain-injured child ever gotten well? Why should a 3-year-old child be helpless and hopeless in a day when airplanes could fly 200 miles an hour, when we could do all sorts of miraculous things? Why had no brain-injured child ever gotten well? It seemed unreasonable, and we spent 7 years answering this question. 7 years. These years were never composed of 5-day weeks. They were composed of 7-day weeks. They were never composed of 8-hour days. They were most often composed of 18-hour days. We have never regretted a second of those hours and days and years, which still go on. Yesterday, a reporter from Asahi asked me a question. He said, why have all of you spent your lives, every minute of every day, doing this work? And I told him that it was a small thing. Today, a citizen of Kobe answered that question for me beautifully. He said that all of his life, he had been happy to work 160 hours a week in order to avoid working a 40-hour week. That's a great piece of wisdom. Anyway, it took us 7 years not to find what to do about brain-injured children, only to find out why they never got well. In those days, we were treating between us about 100 brain-injured children, which was a huge number of children to be treating in those days. And we found out what the matter was. Every child who we were seeing had his problem between here and here. And every child we were treating from here to here. In short, we were treating everybody where his problem was not, and nobody where his problem was. And so we said, golly, won't our colleagues be happy when they find out what the matter is, why no brain-injured child ever gets well? And so in our energy and in our enthusiasm and in our youth, we said, won't our colleagues be happy when we tell them what the matter is? And so we made the only radical announcement we've ever made. Astonishingly, our colleagues were not happy to hear this announcement. and a roar went up. You know, when a mob is yelling, you can't really hear what anybody's saying. It's a sort of a roar, an animal-like roar. What had occasioned this? What was the radical statement we had made? We had said, brain injury is in the brain. And a roar of disapproval went up. It seems strange to me. I should not like to try to set up a thesis that brain injury is in the right knee, or the bladder, or the left eye, or the shoulder. We had only proposed that brain injury was in the brain. And if, therefore, brain injury was in the brain, if you hope to help the child, it would be the brain you would have to treat, and not his knee, or his ear, or his bladder. We and everybody else in the world that we knew were making a mistake that man has made since time has begun. We were treating the symptoms and trying to make the disease go away. It is hardly surprising that that never works. Does it sound radical to you to propose that brain injury is in the brain? The world still does it. So we decided we were going to spend the rest of our lives, if necessary, finding out ways to treat the brain itself. In the screaming that went on, this rather hysterical behavior, there were two questions you could actually hear. Problem was, hardly anybody listened to the answers. The world said, "You don't mean that you're going to treat the brain, do you?" And we said, yes, yep. We were getting annoyed by all the screaming, and we said, yes, we are going to treat the brain. And everybody said, well, how are you going to do that? It exists within a solid skull. And we said, we haven't got the foggiest notion how we're going to do it. We said, we haven't got the vaguest idea of how we're going to do it. But we're going to spend the rest of our lives, if necessary, looking for ways to treat the brain. But by now we were annoyed. And we said, if we should spend the rest of our lives looking for ways to treat the brain and never find one, our failure will not prove your correctness, because what you're doing is ridiculous on the face of it. It is unscientific, it is unmedical, it is irrational, and as if that isn't bad enough, there's the fact that it never works, which by itself is a good enough reason to stop doing it. We proposed that there were three ways that you might treat the brain. First, you might treat it surgically, directly, open the brain. Even the ancients did successful brain surgery. Hippocrates, 2,400 years ago, on his island of Kos, did successful brain surgery, and people survived his brain surgery 2,400 years ago. So we proposed that one way to treat the brain was to treat it surgically. And we and other people have found many ways to treat the brain successfully, surgically. It occurs to me to say to you, you understand that when we speak of the brain, we do not mean that nebulous thing called the mind, which I very little understand. We mean instead this 3 pounds of meat, this physical organ, this physical brain. So when we speak of the brain, we mean this physical organ, this incredible 3 pounds, and not about which we know a great deal, and not that nebulous thing called the mind. So we proposed you could treat it surgically. Secondly, we proposed that you might treat it chemically. We did not feel competent to pursue this, and so we did not. But many other people have pursued the chemical treatment of the brain, and today there are many drugs that affect the brain. Most of them badly, but some of them well. And finally, we proposed that you could treat it externally, that it could be treated non-surgically and externally. And we have developed hundreds of ways to treat the brain non-surgically and externally. The human brain not only is it possible to treat it externally, but it is about the only organ in the body that you can influence externally. As an example, if I said to you, do something as I stand here to affect the function of my liver or my spleen, short of plunging a knife into it, what would you do to affect my liver or spleen function? But you can easily affect my brain, and instantaneously. As an example, if you should all stand up and scream at me, and turn purple with rage, and throw ashtrays at me, you would affect my heart. It would beat very, but only through my brain, because if I could not see you turning purple with rage, which is a brain function, and if I could not hear you screaming insults at me, which is a brain function, and if I could not feel the ashtrays hitting me that you threw at me, which is a brain function, you would affect me not at all. Hey! See, that affects everybody. That's a brain function. No. And so we began to develop, long ago, in the late 1940s, our first crude, not very effective, long drawn out methods to treat the brain itself. And as we did, we saw brain injured children who, for the first time in their lives, instead of getting worse, who began to improve. And more people came and saw what we were doing and joined us. And as methods began to improve and be not quite so inefficient, not quite so long drawn out, we began to see some mildly brain injured children get well. And as methods became still better, more people came to see what we were doing and joined us. And children began to come not only from Philadelphia, but indeed from all around the United States. And as methods got better and better, we began to see an occasional moderately brain injured child who got well. And children began to come from faraway places like Brazil, and more people joined us. We didn't know it, but a new scientific discipline was arising, a new field of scientific endeavor, and that new field is called by us child brain development. And as we stumbled out of the darkness into more and more light, we began to see paralyzed children who were paralyzed from head to toe who learned to walk. And we began to see speechless children who began to talk their heads off. And we began to see children who everybody thought were hopelessly mentally retarded begin to think and behave as well children. We even began to see some blind children who could see and who could read. What was the most astonishing is that we weren't treating the children, we were teaching mothers and fathers to treat the children, and they were doing this. About 10 years ago, I said to our chief statisticians, Susie Wang, Susie, how many children in the past 54 months have come here totally blind? Not legally blind. You can be legally blind and drive a car. You can't be legally blind and legally drive a car, but you can be legally blind and illegally drive a car, and many people do. These children were black blind. These children, if you shined a powerful light in their eye, they did not even have a light reflex, as a normal, well-born child has. And Susie came back and said, there have been 76 blind children who have come here in the past 54 months. And so I said, good, now go back and look at the records again and tell me how many of those blind children now see and read with their eyes, not with their fingers. And she reported that 30 of those 76 blind children could now see and read. Now you understand, these children were not blind in the eye any more than they're actually paralyzed in the arm. They're blind in the brain. I do not mean they're psychologically blind. I don't mean they think they can't see. They are blind in the visual pathway between here and here. And 30 of them could now see and read. Dr. Ralph Pelligra, who was the chief medical officer of NASA, had seen several of these children, and he asked me to present a paper on these children to the staff at NASA. Now, you know, when you write such a paper to present to a scientific group, you must put footnotes in. You must research the literature and say, whoever did this before? And so I researched the paper. Who had ever made blind children see before? And the only footnote I could find, the only reference I could find, was in the 9th chapter of St. John. Christ had made some children see. It was reported in the Bible. So that was an interesting footnote. Christ, 2,000 years ago, had made some blind people see, and now 30 mothers had made some blind children see. As we began to see occasionally even a profoundly brain-injured child get well, two fascinating things happened. The first thing that happened very early on was that in some of these brain-injured children we were dealing with, in order to save their lives, it was necessary to surgically remove half of the brain. Not just the cortex, half the brain, right down the middle. So this human being, you know, there are 1 trillion cells in the human brain. In the early days, the other question people would ask us was, don't you know that when a brain cell's dead, it's dead and there's nothing you can do about it? And we said, yes, we do know that. And everybody said, well then nothing can be done. And we said, and don't you know there are 1 trillion of them? That's 1 followed by 12 zeros. And we said, do you really mean with 1 trillion cells that if a child has 10 of them dead, they must be paralyzed and speechless and have no bladder control? And most everybody said, more or less, yes. And we said, we don't agree with that. We think you could have 100 of them dead and not even know it. And encouraged by the silence, we said, we think you could have 1,000 of them dead and not even know it. Not in our wildest dreams did we imagine what was to come. Half of the brain removed surgically. You know, there are about 100 billion neurons, the functioning units of the brain. And so now we saw children in whom we had taken out half a brain, 50 billion neurons in the head and 50 billion in a jar. And we saw children who could walk and talk and sing and dance, and every once in a while we saw such a child with half a brain in her head or half a brain in his head who had an IQ in the genius area. Happened a long time ago. The neurosurgeon had sent a little 5-year-old girl to see me, and we had never seen each other before. And I had finished seeing a child, and so my secretary went to get this next family, this little girl and her mother. But her mother was in the bathroom. And so my secretary said, little 5-year-old girl, he's waiting for you. So the little 5-year-old girl decided to come in by herself. So this little girl knocked on my office door, and I said, come in. And the door opened, and in she came. She was a rather queen-like little thing, very majestic with a regal bearing. And she walked across my office and stopped in front of my desk and looked at me for a minute. And then she walked around behind my desk and climbed up on my lap, and she said, "I think I'll like you." This little girl could walk and talk and sing and dance, and she had an IQ in the genius area. Armed with this little girl, we could go back to our colleagues who had endlessly chanted their chant, "Dead cells, hopeless, no hope, give up, dead cells, dead cells, dead cells." We could go back to them with this little girl and say, "Would you please explain to this little girl that business about how if you have 10 dead brain cells, you have to be paralyzed or speechless," because she doesn't understand it. Indeed, she's got 50,000 neurons dead and gone. Here, they're in this jar. We brought them for you. Now, would you please explain to her what happens if you have 10 dead cells, because she doesn't understand it. And you can explain it to her in pretty complicated language, too, because she's a genius and you're not. And so perhaps you'd like to explain that to her. You might well ask, if this little girl were so well, why had the brain surgeon sent her to see us? Well, there are two reasons why he sent her to see us. There was the reason he gave me, and then there was the truth. The truth is he sent her to boast about his fine result. What he said was this. Before he had taken out half of her brain, she had been paralyzed on the left side, and her left arm and leg weren't quite as big as her other arm and leg, and he said he was afraid that when she grew up, she wouldn't look well in an evening gown. That's the reason he said that he sent her. But she's grown up now, and she looks fine in an evening gown. The truth is, we didn't do anything for her. She just didn't need us. Now, but what does it mean? By now, we had, perhaps 100 of children in whom it had been required to remove half the brain. Not all these children were geniuses, and not all of them were perfect. Some had poor function on one side of the body or the other. Others had minor speech problems, but they were alive, and they were functioning, and some of them could walk and talk and sing and dance, and had an IQ in the genius area. What did it mean? Surely, the right side of her body was not being run by the dead brain in the jar, half a brain in the jar, by remote control. Surely, the cerebrospinal fluid, which is like water, which now occupied the place where the half brain had been, surely this was not running the other side of the body. Obviously, the only possibility was the remaining half brain was running both sides of the body. There is no other possibility. Obviously, the brain stores not only its memories in both half of the brain, but indeed its function. This operation is called hemispherectomy. Tonsillectomy is the removal of the tonsils. Hemispherectomy is the removal of a hemisphere of the brain. This operation has been done thousands of times around the world. I'm sure it's been done many times in Japan. But here's the question. What does it mean? If I take an average, child A for average, who's 8 years old, and stand him here, and this average child performs at X level, and then I stand beside him a child who has half a brain in his head and half in a jar, who can do everything that the child with a whole brain can do, we must ask the question, what is the matter with the well one? Not what is the matter with the child with half a brain, what is the matter with the well one, that he cannot perform better than the child with half a brain? This was the first clue. The second strange thing that happened was this. Because our brain-injured children were often paralyzed, we were not competing with the other children in sports, etc. And so a question arose. if this child, because he was brain injured, suppose it was going to take him 100 times as long to learn to put on his coat as it took a well child. We had plenty of time, so we said, if it's going to take him so long to put on his coat or talk or walk, why don't we start teaching him at the earliest possible age? And so we began to treat children, brain injured children, at earlier and earlier ages, to teach them at earlier and earlier ages. And lo and behold, the earlier we taught them, the quicker they learned. The implications of this for well children staggered the imagination. And 25 years ago, a very strange thing happened.
25年前、非常に奇妙なことが起こりました。
The Philadelphia school system made a public announcement. They announced that 25% to 30% of well children in the school system could not read. Indeed, 18-year-old children, well children, were graduating from high school in Philadelphia who could not read their own diploma. While in the institutes, we had hundreds of severely brain injured 2-year-olds who could read with understanding. So startling was this that we wrote a book called How to Teach Your Baby to Read. Today, that book is in 20 languages, perhaps more. And millions of mothers have read that book. As I said to you earlier, my proudest physical possession is 100,000 letters from mothers from around the world. More or less, they all say the same thing. They say, I went to the library and got this book, or I bought this book, and I have taught my baby to read. And not only is our love for each other increased by this wonderful experience, but indeed, our respect for each other is increased tremendously. Not only was it our task to make hurt children well, but we had a responsibility to make well children weller. Soon, we had brain-injured children who could read far beyond their years. We had tiny brain-injured children who could do mathematics far beyond their years. We had brain-injured children who had vast knowledge of art, of botany, of every subject one can imagine. Today in Philadelphia, we continue, as we always have, to treat brain-injured children, and parents come from literally every continent on earth to the institutes to be taught how to make brain-injured children well. Mother and father and child come and spend a week in Philadelphia where we teach them what to do. They go homes all over the world, and they do a magnificent job of treating their children. And today, I'm happy to say that parents come from all over the world to take a different one-week course, which is called How to Multiply Your Baby's Intelligence. And so they come and into our auditorium that looks rather like this one, only much smaller. They sit at long desks, and here is a mother or a father and a card saying, Mrs. Smith from Los Angeles, or Mr. Jones from Cheltenham, England, or from Japan, or from wherever in the world. And looking at them, I have no way of knowing whether they are the parents of brain-injured children come to learn how to make their paralyzed child walk, or whether they are the parents of well children come to learn how to make their children weller. They have taught me to have vast love and respect for the parents of the world. About a year ago, in one of the Better Baby courses, one of the mothers sitting over in here said to me, "We have been talking, and we have a question we'd like to ask you." She said, "We have the impression that everything you know about well children you learned from brain-injured children. Is that true?" And I said, "Yes, that's true." And she said, "Then do us a favor. The next time that this room is filled with the parents of brain-injured children, will you thank them for us?" And I said, yes, I would do that. So the next time the room was filled with parents of brain-injured children, I told them that story, and I thanked them on behalf of the parents of well children. And after I had finished doing so, there was a hurried little conference up in the middle of this side of the room, and one of the mothers said, "We have a question for you." She said, "We have an idea that everything you know about brain-injured children, you learn from well children. Is that so?" And I said, "Yes, that's so."